Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to build our own authentication for Ruby on Rails from scratch. Now, in practice, you don't want to do this. Instead, you should depend on some gem or some other very thoroughly code-reviewed tool for building your authentication system. But we're going to build our own today so that we can understand more of the pieces about how authentication works. So recall that in the last episode, we scaffolded out a blog article tool. So if we go back to the browser here, we can come to our post tool. So if we refresh the page, we can go back and we have the ability to update, edit, create posts. What I want to do now is associate posts, which are models in our database, with a specific user. And we're going to walk through the entire flow for how you implement authentication. So let's get into it. All right. So at the very base level, right, when someone creates an account, they're going to give you a username and a password, or an email and a password, something that can uniquely identify them and something that they can memorize or know. So generally, when you're authenticating, you're going to use something that you know, you have, or you are. So if you know something, that's like a password, something you've memorized. What sucks about passwords is they get written down all the time. In order to memorize them, people think of things that are really easy, like the word password. Don't do that. So things that you know are tricky, right? If you don't have like a really complex password or a password management system or something, having a password in your head is tough. So the second piece is something that you have. Maybe you have a physical key, a YubiKey key, or some sort of thing that you can touch that's plugged into the USB port, or maybe you have like a physical card that you touch to a reader. These are all things that you might have, and only you're allowed to have them. If you lose them, then you can call the security people and they can disable your key, and then it's like no longer useful. So that's something that you have. Something that you are. That's like Face ID. When you hold up your phone and you look at your Face ID, that's something that you have. That is like another way that you can authenticate, right? Is through something that you have. So something you know, something you are, or something that you have. These are the three ways you can authenticate. And the email address or the username or the user ID or the account ID, these are all things that will like sort of uniquely identify which user in the database we need to look up. And so generally when you implement a user authentication system, you want to keep track of these things so that you can figure out who is who inside of the database. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build from first principles, and we're going to go through like every step of the process and talk about ways that we can make it just a little bit better as we go. So let's generate, we're going to say Railsg model user, right? And we're going to need to track again that username and password. I'm actually going to use email and password, right? Now, it is very, very bad practice to store an email and password inside of your database in plain text. So if you are storing email and password in clear text, I would like go immediately and change your authentication system so that it does something different, anything different, really. So, but we're going to start off with this, email and password. Okay. I'm going to generate a model that has the email and password, and then we're going to generate, we'll say Railsdb migrate. Again, don't ever store passwords in the database, and we'll talk about why that's really bad. Okay. Next, we need to generate a controller that can create new users. So you want to like allow people to sign up. So we're going to say Railsg controller users. And on the users controller, I'm just going to create a new view and we'll just start with a new view. That'll allow us to at least register users. Okay. All right. Let's go to our routes. We have a new get route for like register, and that's going to go to the users controllers create action. All right, so let's go to our users controller. And here we have a new route. This is going to render the form back that has the username and password fields, or the email and passwords fields. And we're going to also create a create action, but we'll come back and do that in just a moment. So let's go to our new view. For users. So this is our registration form. And for now, we're going to add a form that's going to send a post request to /users. This little bit here is our authenticity token. We want to have the authenticity token in the form so that we don't receive cross-site requests that are forged. And so let's add an input for the email. And the value is going to start off with @user.email. And initially, the user is just going to be empty, but we'll talk about that in a second. And the name is going to be user email. So we're going to send in the post request, we're going to send a hash where it's user points at another hash, and that hash has a key email and a value with whatever we typed in as the email. And let's also create another field for the password. Let's actually do it this way. So there is a type, an input type of password. And the value here is, we don't want to type anything into the value because we never ever want the value to be like pre-filled, right? So we're going to remove that. But we do need a name. So the name here is going to be user password. Okay. And instead of submit, we're going to say register. And let's go back to our form here. Now we should be able to go to like /register and see this form we just created. Create is missing a template. You know what? This register is supposed to be to /new. And then we should have like just user, like resources, users only, create. Sure. Undefined method email for nil class. So here we're trying to call email on an instance variable @user, but @user doesn't exist yet. So let's go back to our new route for the users controller here, and we want to create a blank user. So we're going to say @user equals user.new. Okay. And we're going to refresh our page, and now we see the email and password input. I'm going to give it an email, wave@cjav.dev, and the password is going to be password 123, because our create action doesn't have any logic. So we need to implement some logic to actually save this data in the database. Now, if we go down to the request that we received, so we started a post request to /users, we got the authenticity token, and we got this hash user points at email. That's the email that we received. Password is the password. There's a really helpful thing in Rails where it's like, oh, we think we're receiving something sensitive. Let's filter that out. So it filtered out our password, thankfully, right? And so that didn't actually get saved. And because there was no template and no logic inside of create, we just rendered back empty. So here what we want to do is actually create our user. So we're going to say @user equals user.new, user params, private def user params. We're going to say params.require user.permit email and password. Okay. And I feel so dirty saving the password in the database already. Like this is so bad. But we're going to come back and we're going to fix it. We're going to make it better, I promise. So now we're going to say if @user.save, maybe like redirect to like posts path, else render new, and we'll leave it there. So now if we refresh the page and we say our email is this and our password is password, and we say register. Okay, now we got redirected to the /posts page. Right now we are seeing all the posts, and let's go look in the database. All right, so we're going to look at the database, and the way that you can log into the database is with Railsdb Console. This gives you like a really quick way to log into whatever database you're using. And so this is us actually messing around with the Postgres database that's underlying our data. So we can here say select star from users, and this is going to give us the data that's in the database. And this was literally the password that I typed in on the front end. Now, if some attacker was able to get into your system, which there's new attacks that come out every single day. If someone's able to get into your system and dump your database, you're now seeing the combination of email and password. Have you ever used the same email and password at multiple different places? Think about that. It's terrifying. There's like a lump in my throat thinking about like, oh gosh, I used to do this all the time before I had a password manager, which you just saw pop up. So if your database of email and password stored in plain text is compromised and you lose, like this gets leaked out into the world or bought on the darknet, or, there's tons and tons of issues with this, right? Because now attackers can attempt to use this email address and this password at thousands of other sites, right? They can try it on banks. They can try it at, on crypto sites. They can try it on email accounts. If they can get into your email account, they can get into, they can start doing password recovery for other systems. So this is really, really bad, like really, really bad. So we do not ever want to store the password in the database in plain text, but we're going to keep going. All right, the next step here is that we need a way for people to log in, and we need to know who the logged in user is. So we've created a user, they're in our database, but we don't have a concept of whether a user is logged in or not. And we're going to talk about how that works. In order to log in, a user needs to provide their email and their password. So they're going to provide their email and their password, and we somehow need to figure out like who was that logged in user and how do we keep track of who's logged in and who's allowed to access what, right? And so one way to solve this is using a mechanism called cookies. So the way that a cookie works is the server is allowed to write some data into the response that's sent back to the browser, and then the browser will say, oh, I received a cookie from the server. Let me write that into my log that says, anytime I am going to send a request back to that same server, I'm going to pass the cookie back to that server. This is how you can like persist, how you can establish a persistence between requests. So typically the web is stateless, meaning that like when you make a request and you receive a response, the next request you make generally knows nothing about the previous request. They're all going to be individual requests and responses that are going back and forth. The only mechanism that we have to sort of persist state between requests as part of a session is to store data into some cookie or pass data back and forth between the browser and the client for every single request that's happening. And so typically the way that, one of the standard ways this works is by storing reference to whatever the logged in user is inside of the cookie. Okay, so we're going to store, when a user logs in, we're going to say, oh, we found the user in the database. We're going to take their ID or their email address or something that uniquely identifies that user, and we are going to stick that into a cookie from the server and send it back to the client. And then every request the client makes for the rest of that session is going to pass that same identifier back to the server, and we'll be able to use that identifier to look up who the current user is and associate our queries and all the data and the access and the authorization with whoever that current user is. And so let's go through the process of building out what I'm going to call a sessions controller. This is just the controller that manages creating that cookie and that relationship between each of the requests that are going to happen for this specific user from this point forward. So I'm going to say Railsg controller sessions. And again, we're just going to have new, and that'll probably be good to start. We're going to first open up our routes and go down here and add, let's say get to /sign in is going to go to sessions, sessions new. And we'll also say get like sign out is going to go to sessions destroy. And then we'll also say resource sessions only create. That'll be where we receive the post request for creating the session. Okay, so sessions /new is sign in, sign out. We got sessions. Okay, let's go to the sessions controller. And in our sessions controller, again, we're actually going to use the user model because that's going to be the model that stores the email and something, not the password, but something. We're going to say @user is equal to user.new when we're on the new view, and then we're going to say create. And inside of create is where we're going to like look up the user. If they exist in the database, we're going to cookie them and then start keeping track of their requests and responses. So let's go to the new view. Sessions new. This is actually going to be basically users new with a small change. Okay, so instead of going to /users, we're going to go /sessions. And this is going to be called sign in. And instead of register, we're going to say sign in. And everything else is just going to stay the same. Okay, so if we go back to our browser and go to /sign in, we should receive that view. Okay, we do. And we should say, okay, I'm gonna say wave. I'm gonna type in password. and hit sign in. And this should hit our create action, which isn't defined yet. And we got back a blank response. So we see the same page. So let's go back to our sessions controller and figure out how we want to do this create. So first we need to like look up the user. Then we need to like compare their password, right? Okay, so the first step to look up the user in the database, we're going to say @user equals user.find by, and then the thing we're going to find them by is their email address. The email address is always going to come in plain text. It's okay if it's in plain text in the database too. Okay, so we're going to find them by their email address, and in the request that we just received, we're going to receive some like user params again, and that's going to have an email. So this user params method is going to be the same as our users controller. So I'm just going to come down here and copy these 5 lines. And all right, so user params email, that's going to give us the email address that they typed in. If we found the user, so if there is a user, and if @user.password is the same as user params password, then we want to like cookie them. So we want to set a cookie with that user's ID so that we can keep track of them in between requests. All right, so now we're going to say cookies at, maybe we call it like user ID is equal to @user.id. Okay, and then we can say render or like redirect to posts path. All right, so if we either did not find the user in the database or the password did not match, what we want to do is we're going to re-render new. And before we re-render new, we actually want that notice to show up on the page. So we're going to say flash.now:notice so that we have a notice that's in there just for this rendering that is in response to this request. We're going to say invalid email or password. And if either the email was wrong and we didn't find a user, or because the password was wrong and it didn't match the password for the user, we want to set that notice up. And from the new view, here at the top, we can add a p tag with ID notice, and we'll print out that notice again. This was very similar to what was used by default inside of the posts, the scaffold for the posts. And if we go back to our browser now and type in an email address, and then we leave the password blank, we can say sign in, and that gives us invalid email or password. And if we try another password, which is the actual password, and click sign in, then we're redirected to /posts. If I right click and go to inspect to open up the Chrome developer tools and go to the application and cookies here, so we're going to see a cookie, and each cookie that the browser stores is related to a specific domain or a specific like server, right? So in this case, localhost 3000. And inside here, we see user ID 1, and we actually see the value 1 inside of the cookie directly in the browser. Now, think for a moment why this might be bad. So a couple things, right? We see the raw value for the cookie. So we can see exactly what's in the cookie. We can see the key is user_ID, and we can see the value is 1. Now, let's just log in as user 3. Okay, now we're logged in as user 3. So let's talk about how we're actually going to use this cookie to look up the user, and then we'll go back and fix the issue with why that's bad, and that's like should not be inside of directly inside of the cookie like that in plain text. So generally inside of application controller or somewhere around here, we will have methods for looking up who is the current user. So we're going to write a method current user, and the whole job of this method is to look at the cookies that we received and look up the user in the database who has that ID or that whatever we're tracking by. So we're going to say user.find cookies user ID, and that's what we're going to return as our current user. So if we come over here and we go to our let's see, layout.application.html.erb, this is kind of like the master layout view that's going to be used for all of our views by default. At the top, we can say if If there's a current user, then let's just print out like hi, and then their email address, current user.email. And before we can call this method here, this current user method inside of the view, we need to make it available to the view. So by default, the instance variables we create in the controller, those are all going to be available to the view. Any methods we write in helpers are going to be available to the view. But if we want a method that's inside the controller to be available in the view, we need to use this special thing called a helper method. So we're going to say that current user is a helper method that we're going to call from the view. So now if we come back to our browser and we refresh the page here, we are, couldn't find a user with the ID 3. Yeah, because we logged in as a different user. Let's actually go in the database, Rails C. So we'll say Rails console. We'll use the Rails console to create a second user. So user.new, email is test2 example.com. Password is fancy password. Or instead of .new, we can say .create. Bang. Okay, so that puts it in the database. And now we can log in as user2 just by changing that. And we'll refresh the page here. So now we're logged in as user2. Hi, test2 And if we want to log in as ourselves, we can change that to user1. And then we can refresh the page. Hi, wave@cjfdev. So just by changing the cookie value, we're logging in as different users. So that's really bad. And if we wanted to log out, we could right-click this and say delete, right? Delete the cookie. And now if we refresh, no one's logged in. And now we have an error that says we couldn't find the user without an ID. So we need to improve our current user method here. And one thing we can say is like if cookies at user ID. So if there is a value there, then return this thing. Otherwise don't. And then we can refresh the page. Now we don't have any logged in user. And if we wanted to, we could come over here and log in by just creating a cookie, which is bad. So sessions or like sign, well, let's sign in again. We're going to pass in wave@cjfdev, password, and we're signed in. Now we see we're cookied with our user ID here. And we can just change that again to 2 to log in as this other user. Again, very bad, but you can see that like by the fact that I'm refreshing the page here, I'm sending a new request. The values here in the cookie are being sent to the server, and then the server is able to use that cookie to look up the user in the database and return it, or like then use it as part of the controller's response. So typically what we might do is scope all of these posts to the current logged in user, and we'll do that later after we clean up all of our security vulnerabilities. So the first one that I want to do is let's talk about how we can make this cookie encrypted. So there's a couple different ways. So you can go back to where we set the cookie. So inside of the sessions controller here, where we set the cookie, this is us like logging the user in, right? This is where we're actually setting the cookie. We don't want to just use cookies with square brackets because that's going to set a plain text cookie. All right, so instead of using cookies with square brackets directly, we want to use some other helpful methods that are available for cookies. So here is the documentation for Rails cookies. Here, this is where the cookie will be stored in plain text. We've also got cookies.signed. This means that the user cannot mess around with the cookie. So let's start here and change it to signed. So we'll say cookies.signed. Go back to sign in. This is when we sign in is where we're going to use the signed cookie. So now we can say password. We're going to click sign in. And now you'll notice that our cookie has like some crazy value that we're not able to tell what it is. So it's a little bit trickier to mess with. Hard to tell that that's actually, some actual valid value. And we get an error that says we couldn't find a user with that ID. So we actually need to come back over here to our application controller and use cookies.signed to pull it out of the database like that. And now when we refresh, we can see wave@cjfdev. But this cookie signing thing isn't super secure. That's not actually like securing it. It's just making it so that it's harder to tamper with. There is yet another tool here that allows us to encrypt the cookie. So we can chain these together. So we can say permanent signed or signed encrypted or whatever. So we're going to actually like encrypt. We're going to encrypt this too. So we're going to say encrypted.signed. So now when we log out, by deleting our cookie here and refreshing the page, we don't see ourselves logged in. We're going to go back to sign in. We're going to log back in. And now that we're signed in, now this cookie is both encrypted and signed. Now look at how complex that looks. There's no way we're messing around with that, right? And we're definitely not going to switch to another user just by futzing around with this, this user ID that's here. Now, in practice, instead of using cookies at all, what we generally do, we'll use something called the session. So session is another sort of tool that's available inside of the controller, and it works by default with encrypted cookies. So we can change this entire thing here to just session and store the user ID in the session. And then here we can say session. If there's a session, then look up the current user by the session. And we'll come back over here, refresh the page. We're not logged in anymore. We can delete this. We can refresh the page and go back to /sign in, and we'll log back in. Password. So again, session is going to be maintained a very similar way as cookies, but now we no longer actually see any cookie with user ID over here. We don't actually know what's stored in that session. We just know that there's some cookies, they're being used for something, and somewhere inside of this blob is where our user ID is stored. And on the server, we're able to look that up and pull out the user from the database and print out their email address here. So that was like the first big improvement, is we switched from just like a raw cookie that you could mess around with to a signed one, to an encrypted one. And now we are using session, which is using signed encrypted cookies, but it's storing it inside of a value where we don't actually know what the keys are for those cookies. So now we are in a much better place in terms of cookies. The next thing is we want to fix our password issue. So passwords, we don't want to store them right in the database, right? So right now, if we say like user.pluck password, we're going to see these are the raw passwords for our users, password, fancy password, etc. We don't want to be able to do that. So instead, what we want to do is we're going to say like Railsg migration change password field or something like that. Change password to password digest. And we will write a little bit of a migration to rename our password field. So let's update. We're going to like rename column on users from password to password digest. Railsdb migrate. Now, instead of storing the raw password in the database, what we're going to do is use a hashing function. So a hashing function, it's going to be a one-way hashing function. The hashing function is going to take some raw input, in this case, the password, and it's going to run it through some function. And that function is going to consistently and reliably and in a stable way generate some other random string, where you cannot take that random string and go backwards to the password without like tons and tons and tons and tons of work. So much work that it would take longer than our lifetime in order to do, at least with the current computing capacity that we know about. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Bcrypt, which is a tool for creating secure passwords. So we're going to do this. We're going to open up our gem file. We're going to look at Bcrypt, and we're going to install this gem, Bcrypt. Bcrypt, you'll notice that there is like has secure password. That is like a shortcut. We're not going to use that yet. We're going to use Bcrypt directly and talk about how Bcrypt might use a one-way password hashing in order to take some raw input and then store it in the database in a way that you cannot reverse. So we're going to install this gem. So we're going to say bundle install. Okay, now we've installed Bcrypt. We can go use this. So we're actually not going to change our user's controller here. Okay. When we create a new user, we are going to continue passing down user params, where we're going to continue passing down this email and the raw password. But we renamed the column in the database to password digest. So if we say user.pluck password, it doesn't have password anymore. Select password from users doesn't exist anymore. We could say pluck password digest, and this is going to give us those passwords, but we're no longer going to store the raw plain text password anymore. But we do need a method where we can set the password. So let's go to the user model. So here, let's actually say like user.destroy all, just so we can start from scratch. And we will, let's clear this out. Let's actually keep the console somewhere. All right, so on our user model, we're going to write a setter method where we can receive a password in raw plain text. So we're gonna say def password equals, and this is gonna give us our plain text password. So we need to take in that raw password and use Bcrypt as a one-way hashing function to create our password. All right, so this is the documentation for Bcrypt. There is a class called Bcrypt password, and the way that it works is we call password.create, and we pass it in the secret, and we get back this giant hashed thing. Okay, so we're gonna say Bcrypt password.create raw. Okay, that's gonna give us back a password that's been like hashed. If our password is banana and we pass in banana, this Bcrypt password.create is gonna return some giant hashed thing. When we get that value back, that is what we're gonna stick in the database. So here what we actually wanna do is call self.passworddigest equals Bcrypt password.create. So this is gonna create the password hash based on our input password and store the hash in the database, not the raw plain text password. So, okay, so let's save that. Railsc, we're gonna say u equals user.new. Now if we say u.password equals test, and then we say u, the password digest is filtered. So if we say u.password digest, this does not equal test. So now if we try to say like u.password, we don't actually get the password back because there's no reader method for password. There's no way to like look at the raw password inside of the database, right? And so now in the database, if we were to save this user, if we said like u.save bang, that's gonna save a user in the database. Now if we go to Railsdb Console and try to look at the data that's in the database, like maybe this is the data that gets leaked on the darknet or something, right? We can say like select star from users. And at this point, we have the ID, we have no email entered, and we have this giant thing that who knows how to get back to test from this. No one, except what we can do is Railsc. We can now take that password digest and check to see if the hash for another input matches the hash. So we can like rehash some other input when we're logging back in and check to see if those hashed outputs match. So now we can say like, okay, we have this user in the database, u equals user.last, right? Now what we want to do is check to see if we can figure out what that user's, or if we can authenticate as that user by checking with Bcrypt, password.new u.passworddigest.isPassword, and then we can pass in test, and that returns true. So what we're doing here is we're initializing an instance of a Bcrypt password with the hash that's in the database, and then a method on that password instance is called isPassword, and you can pass that a plain text thing that will hash test again and check to see if test is the password in the database. So is the password banana? No, it's not. So that's false. So it does not match. You can also add like entropy to these things. So like it requires a certain number of passes so that it requires even more computation to create the password, check the password, etc. Tool that we're going to use to confirm that it is the password when someone is logging back in. So we're going to go back to the user model, and we're going to add another method here called isPassword. And this is going to take in the raw, and we're going to say here we want to initialize a new instance of a Bcrypt password object. So Bcrypt password.new, and the way we initialize it is with whatever is in the database already. So password digest, and then we're going to call .isPassword on that instance, passing in the raw, and whatever we get back from this isPassword method is what whether or not that is their actual password. Notice that here I'm using just password digest as a bare word. I don't call self.passworddigest. Here I did use self.passworddigest. That's because I'm calling a setter method. And when you're using a setter method, you have to prefix with self dot so it doesn't think that you're creating a local variable inside of this method. All right, so now that we've got these, let's go back to our sessions controller and update this logic. So instead of just checking if the password that was passed in matches the password that we're able to look up on the user, let's now say user.isPassword and pass in the password that was sent to us from the front end. So now we can refresh this page. Actually, let's log out. Couldn't find user with ID 1. Because we deleted them from the database. All right, so let's do that. Rails C user.destroy all. And then we got to like log out, so we're just going to delete this session cookie thing. Okay, so now we're going to go to sign in, and we're going to enter, or actually we need to register, so let's go to /register. And when we register, we're going to put in our email, and when we put in our password now, I'm going to again put in password. And when I click register, uninitialized constant. We need to restart the server. So if you get this error, uninitialized constant Bcrypt, we installed the gem, so it should have the gem, right? But we're getting this uninitialized constant because after I installed the gem, I did not restart the server. So I got to stop the server with Control-C, restart the server with Rails S, and then we'll come back over here, refresh the page, go back to /register, and okay, let's try this again. Banana, click register. All right, fantastic. We're again seeing our posts. We don't see, are we logged in? We see the session here. Why don't we see the session at the top? Oh, you know what? Okay, so this is great. This is great. When we're creating the user for the first time, we're redirecting to /posts, but we didn't do the bit where we're setting the user ID on the session. Okay, so in the users controller, after we create the user right here, we're redirecting to posts, but we're not actually logging the user in. So there is no logged in user at this point. We created the user, but they're not signed in. So let's go to sign in. In practice too, you might hide that list of posts or something. So we'll sign back in, put in our email and our password, and now we are signed back in. And we can see our email address at the top, and we're totally logged back in. If we go back over here and we say Railsdb Console, the user that we created should not have a password, a raw plain text password in the database. We can say select * from users, and we see this hashed password now in the database. That is looking fantastic, right? That is looking really, really good. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. All right. Next step here is that generally you want to have like some restrictions around the password that you're creating, right? You don't want people to just sign up with like x@example.com and then have their password be like A and be able to register. You shouldn't be able to register if your password is just one character. There's not enough entropy in a one character password to be secure. Like someone could just guess that if you were allowed to have one character passwords. So the next thing we want to do is add some validations to our user model that requires that the password that's passed in, the raw password that's passed in, has at least some sort of restrictions or some sort of limits. So we'll go to the user model here, and in order to actually like ensure things about the password that we're creating are valid, we're going to add some validations. All right, so inside of our user model, we want to validate the password has a length of at least 9 and allow nil true. So when we say validates and then pass it some symbol here, it is going to, the model is going to call this method on the instance of the model when it's running its validations. And it is going to check to see if whatever is returned from this method passes these validations. So in this case, what we're saying is like whatever the value is returned from the password method must be at least 9 or it can be nil. And the reason why we're saying it can be nil is that we want to be able to update the users, maybe want to update the user's email address or their profile picture or something like that. When we're updating, we're also going to run the same validations. And in the update case, we're not going to have any password at that point. So we're only going to validate this password is at least 9 characters. Let's actually make this a little bit shorter. We'll just say like 4 so that we have, it's like easy to play with, maybe 5. We're going to validate this password only when we are creating the user or updating the user's password explicitly. And so how does this actually work? So it's actually going to call the password method. And right now we don't actually have a password method. We have a password equals setter method, but we do not have a password getter method. So we could write a method here like def password, but how would we return the raw value for the password that was passed in without saving it in the database? Well, what we want to do is we're actually going to store the password in memory for just a second. When someone passes in the password, we're going to store it in memory here. We're going to say @password is equal to raw. Now this @password instance variable is not put in the database in any way. It's just in memory for the duration of that single request to create the user. And in our getter method for the password, here we can say @password. So when the password method is called during the validation step before the user is saved in the database, we will check to see if the password is nil or if the password is at least 5 characters long. All right, so let's test this out. So we're going to refresh the page. We're going to go back to register. We're going to type in our maybe wave 2. And then if we type in a password that's 1 character long and say register, it failed, but we didn't get any notification. So let's go update. Let's go update our users new so that it has a ID or P ID notice. And then we'll go back to our users controller where we're registering. And if we fail, we're again going to say flash.now notice equals like @user.errors.full messages.to sentence. All right, so let's refresh. All right, password is too short. The minimum is 5 characters. So now we are getting some feedback here that we're not allowed to pass in a password that's too short. So now we'll try more than 2 characters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 5 characters, and we'll say register. Now we have successfully registered and we were relogged in as the same email address. Okay, so now let's look in the database, Rails console, user.pluck email. Uh-oh, we've got 2 people with the email of x@example.com. So that's a problem. So we've got to go back over to our user model and let's add another validation. So validates email uniqueness true. Okay, so now if we were to come back over here and try to go to register, and we're still logged in, so let's like log ourselves out, delete, and we say let's like try to register with the same email address with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and say register. That fails. Invalid authenticity token. Because we deleted the cookie after the page was loaded. Let's try this again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Register. Email has already been taken. Fantastic. So now we are ensuring that the email is unique and that the password is hashed and that the password is a certain length. We're getting somewhere. Let's try another thing. What if we registered with just a password? If we just say register, that worked. If we look at the user.last, their email address is empty. That's not cool. That is not cool. So let's go back to our user and make sure that we have an email. So we're going to say validates email presence true. So we want to make sure that we actually have an email. So if we go back to register and we try to register again with no email, we get an error that says email has already been taken and email can't be blank. So it both has to be unique and it can't be blank. So that can be really handy for validating that the email and password is valid, or that we have an email and we have a password and the password is at least 5 characters. You could write your own custom validation too that ensured that the password was at least 8 characters and had at least 1 number and at least 1 symbol, et cetera, so that you were enforcing good password behavior. In practice, I think email and password is going away in place, like in preference of having like sending a magic link to an email address, and or sending a text message with some code, and or like using a third-party auth provider like Authy or Google Authenticator. So this is really just talking about the fundamentals of how you might build an authentication system. Again, we are going through the whole process here by hand. There are these like helper methods called has secure password that does a lot of this stuff for you. But I wanted to show like all the different pieces and how this might actually work under the hood so that they are familiar. And if you need to actually debug something or get into something, you can do that and you know where to find things. And then in the next episode, what I want to do is actually scope the list of posts. So posts here, we will scope this down to only the posts that are associated with the current user. And we will update the scaffolded posts controller to use the current user, the authenticated user, to only show them their own posts, basically. So that will be fun in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a ton. And yeah, we'll see you next time.